The abandoned mansion sits rotting in the Virginia hills, its broken windows like dead eyes watching the valley below. Sarah Chen parks her rental car at the rusted gates, knowing she shouldn't be here alone. The anonymous letter in her pocket promises evidence that will destroy the Greymoor family, one of America's oldest political dynasties. What the letter doesn't mention is why 3 other journalists who came here never made it home. Sarah isn't just any reporter. She spent 5 years tracking missing persons cases that all lead back to one name, Greymoor. Her own sister vanished while researching their family tree, leaving behind only cryptic notes about bloodline preservation and genetic purity. Now Sarah has discovered the truth. Generations of systematic inbreeding have created something monstrous, and the Greymoors have been covering their tracks with murder. The mansion's front door hangs open, creaking in the wind. Inside, Sarah knows, lie documents proving a conspiracy that reaches from backwoods Virginia to the halls of Congress. But as she steps toward the threshold, one question haunts her. If the Greymoors have been hiding their corruption for over a century, what makes her think she'll survive exposing it? The October air carries the scent of decay and something else, something sweet and cloying that makes her stomach turn. Sarah pulls her jacket tighter and forces herself forward. The gravel driveway crunches beneath her boots, each step echoing off the deteriorating facade. Ivy crawls up the mansion's walls like diseased veins, and she notices how the plants themselves seem twisted, their leaves an unnatural shade of purple-black. Her phone buzzes. A text from her editor, "Where are you? Call me." She switches it to silent. Marcus would try to talk her out of this, just like he'd tried to convince her to drop the Greymoor investigation entirely. Too dangerous, he'd said, too powerful. But Marcus hadn't seen Jenny's notebook, hadn't read the desperate scrawl in her sister's handwriting. They're not human anymore. Generations of keeping the blood pure have made them into something else. The front steps sag under Sarah's weight, wood soft with rot. She pauses at the threshold, pulling out her digital recorder and the small canister of pepper spray clipped to her keychain. Fat lot of good either would do if the stories were true, but they made her feel marginally less helpless. The foyer stretches before her, grand even in decay. A chandelier hangs at an impossible angle, its crystals dark with grime. Family portraits line the walls, generations of Greymoors staring down with pale eyes that seem to track her movement. As she moves deeper into the house, she notices something disturbing about the paintings. The faces barely change from century to century. The same sharp cheekbones, the same translucent skin, the same unsettling gaze. It's as if time has stood still for this family, evolution halted by their obsession with genetic purity. Her footsteps echo in the vast space as she follows the anonymous letter's directions. 3rd floor, master bedroom, loose floorboard beneath the window. The staircase groans ominously but holds. On the 2nd floor landing, she stops. The smell is stronger here, that sweet rot that makes her gag. Through an open doorway, she glimpses what might have once been a nursery. Cribs line the walls, far too many cribs for any normal family. Some are tiny, others larger, as if built to accommodate children who grew in unexpected ways. Sarah doesn't linger. She needs to find the documents and get out. The 3rd floor hallway stretches endlessly in both directions. Door after door stands slightly ajar, offering glimpses of rooms frozen in time. She finds the master bedroom at the hall's end. Afternoon light filters through broken shutters, casting prison bar shadows across dusty furniture. The 4-poster bed dominates the space, its canopy torn and stained with something brown and ancient. She kneels by the window and runs her hands across the warped floorboards. There, one shifts slightly under pressure. She pries it up with her car key, wincing at the screech of old nails. Underneath, wrapped in oiled leather, sits a wooden box. Inside the box, photographs, letters, medical records spanning decades. Her hands shake as she sorts through them. Birth certificates with impossible dates, children born to mothers who would have been over 60, marriage licenses between siblings, laboratory reports detailing genetic abnormalities that should have been fatal but somehow weren't. And photographs. God, the photographs. She's so absorbed in the documents that she doesn't hear the car pulling up the driveway outside, doesn't notice the footsteps on the front stairs until they're already echoing in the foyer below. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving with purpose. Sarah's blood turns to ice. She stuffs the documents into her jacket and moves to the window. 3 black SUVs sit behind her rental car, blocking any escape route. Men in dark suits emerge, their movements coordinated, professional. At their center stands a tall figure she recognizes from newspaper photos, Senator Marcus Greymoor himself. The footsteps reach the 2nd floor. Sarah looks around desperately for another way out, but she's trapped. The Greymoors have come to protect their secrets, just as they have for over a century, and she's about to discover exactly how far they'll go to keep them buried. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have as Sarah Chen turned it over in her hands for the 3rd time that morning. No return address, no postmark, just her name written in careful block letters across the front. Someone had slipped it under her apartment door sometime during the night while she slept. Inside, a single photograph and a handwritten note on expensive cream-colored paper. The photograph showed a sprawling estate nestled against rolling hills, its Gothic architecture imposing even in the faded colors of what looked like a 1970s snapshot. The note was brief. The Greymoor family. Look closer at the bloodline. They've been hiding something for generations. A friend. Sarah had covered enough stories to recognize a dead end when she saw one, but something about the cryptic message nagged at her. She'd built her reputation at the Washington Herald by following leads other journalists dismissed, digging into stories that seemed too far-fetched or too dangerous for mainstream coverage. Last year's exposé on pharmaceutical companies manipulating clinical trials had earned her a Polk Award and several death threats. This felt different, though, more personal somehow. She pulled up her laptop and typed Greymoor family into the search bar. The results were surprisingly sparse for what appeared to be a wealthy family. A few mentions in society pages spanning decades, some real estate transactions involving properties across New England, and a handful of obituaries. Nothing scandalous, nothing that would warrant an anonymous tip. But Sarah had learned that the absence of information was often more telling than its presence. The obituaries proved most interesting. Dating back to the 1920s, they painted a picture of a family that seemed unusually insular. Greymoors married other Greymoors with startling frequency. Cousins, distant relatives, always keeping the bloodline close. The pattern continued through the decades with an almost religious devotion to genetic isolation. Her phone buzzed. Marcus Webb, her editor, his text characteristically blunt, "Need you in the office now." Sarah grabbed her jacket and the envelope, her mind already cataloguing questions. Who had access to her apartment building? Who knew enough about her work habits to know she'd follow up on something this vague? And why the Greymoors specifically? The Herald's newsroom buzzed with its usual controlled chaos, but Marcus's office felt different when she arrived. He was pacing behind his desk, his normally unflappable demeanor cracked around the edges. "Tell me you're not working on anything involving the Greymoor family," he said without preamble. Sarah's blood chilled. "Why would you ask that?" "Because I got a call 20 minutes ago from someone claiming to represent their interests. Very polite, very professional, asking if we had any reporters looking into their family history." Marcus stopped pacing and fixed her with a stare. "I told them no, of course, but then I thought about your tendency to chase shadows, and I got worried." Sarah set the envelope on his desk. "Someone left this for me." Marcus examined the contents, his frown deepening. "This could be from anyone, Sarah. A crank, someone with a grudge, a conspiracy theorist with too much time. Then why did they call you?" The question hung in the air between them. Marcus sank into his chair, suddenly looking older than his 53 years. "I don't know, but I've been in this business long enough to recognize when someone's trying to send a message. They're watching. That's exactly why I need to dig deeper." Sarah leaned forward, her instincts firing. If they're worried enough to make preemptive calls, there's something worth finding. Or there's something worth dying for. Marcus's voice carried a weight she'd rarely heard from him. I've seen good reporters disappear chasing stories like this. Rich families with old secrets have resources we can't imagine. Sarah studied the photograph again, focusing on details she'd missed earlier. In one of the estate's windows, barely visible, stood a figure. A woman in what looked like a wedding dress, her face obscured by shadows, but her posture suggesting someone much younger than the elaborate gown's style would indicate. "Give me 48 hours, she said finally, just to see if there's anything concrete. If it's nothing, I'll drop it." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, weighing risks against the Herald's reputation for fearless journalism. Finally, he nodded. 48 hours, but you check in every 6 hours and you don't go anywhere alone. And Sarah, if you feel like you're being watched or followed, you drop this immediately. As Sarah left his office, the weight of the envelope seemed to have doubled. She could feel eyes on her as she walked through the newsroom, though when she turned to look, everyone appeared absorbed in their work. The sensation followed her to the elevator, into the parking garage, and all the way home. That night, she double-checked her locks and drew the curtains tight before spreading the Greymoor research across her kitchen table. Somewhere in the bloodlines and property records and carefully worded obituaries lay a secret worth killing for. She just had to find it before they found her. Sarah's hands trembled as she spread the photographs across her kitchen table, each image more disturbing than the last. The anonymous package had arrived that morning, wrapped in brown paper with no return address. Inside, dozens of black and white photographs spanning decades, maybe centuries, all bearing the same distinctive watermark, a stylized letter G enclosed in an ornate family crest. The faces staring back at her were unmistakably related, sharing the same sharp cheekbones, pale eyes, and aristocratic bearing. But something was wrong with the progression of generations. Children who should have been cousins bore an unsettling resemblance to their parents. Brothers and sisters stood too close in formal portraits, their eyes holding secrets that made Sarah's skin crawl. She picked up a photograph dated 1924, showing a wedding party on the steps of what appeared to be a massive estate. The bride and groom's similarity was so pronounced they could have been twins. Sarah's journalism instincts kicked in, and she reached for her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard as she began cross-referencing names and dates. The Greymoor family tree emerged slowly from public records, census data, and newspaper archives. What she found made her stomach turn. Generation after generation of marriages between first cousins, uncles, and nieces, even closer relations that defied both law and nature. The family had carefully constructed elaborate cover stories, fake adoptions, and falsified birth certificates to hide their systematic inbreeding. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number: "Stop digging or join the family portrait permanently." Sarah's blood ran cold. She grabbed the photographs, shoving them into a manila envelope, and headed for her car. If someone was watching her closely enough to know what she was investigating, she needed backup. Her editor at the Tribune, Marcus Webb, had 30 years of experience with dangerous stories. He would know what to do. The newsroom was nearly empty when she arrived, just a skeleton crew working the night shift. Marcus's office light was on, casting long shadows down the hallway. She knocked twice before entering, finding him hunched over his computer, reading glasses perched on his nose. "Sarah, what are you doing here so late?" He looked up, concern creasing his weathered face when he saw her expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have." She closed the door behind her and pulled out the photographs. "Marcus, I need you to look at something, but I have to warn you. This could be dangerous." She spread the images across his desk, watching his expression change from curiosity to revulsion as he examined each one. He picked up a particularly disturbing family portrait from the 1950s, studying the faces with a journalist's eye for detail. "Jesus Christ, Sarah, where did you get these?" "Anonymous delivery this morning." But that's not all. She showed him her research, the family tree that revealed a century of systematic inbreeding among one of America's most powerful political dynasties. The Greymoors have been doing this for generations, and they've been covering it up with murder, bribery, and corruption that goes all the way to the top. Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. Do you have any idea how many people this family could destroy? How many careers, how many lives? That's exactly why we need to expose them. Sarah's voice carried a conviction that surprised even her. Whatever they're hiding is worth killing for. I got a threatening text 20 minutes ago. Before Marcus could respond, the lights in the newsroom went out. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting everything in an eerie red glow. Through the glass walls of the office, Sarah could see figures moving between the desks outside. Too many figures for the small night crew. Get under the desk, Marcus whispered, reaching for his phone. But the phone lines were dead, and Sarah realized with growing terror that they were trapped. The figures outside moved with purpose, systematically checking each workstation, each office, searching for something specific, or someone. The fire escape, Marcus mouthed silently, pointing toward the window behind his desk. Sarah gathered the photographs while he quietly unlocked the window. The old mechanism protested with a faint squeak that sounded deafening in the silence. Footsteps approached the office door. Sarah stuffed the envelope inside her jacket and slipped through the window onto the metal fire escape, Marcus close behind. 3 flights down to the alley, trying not to let their footsteps ring out against the metal grating. They had almost reached the bottom when the office window above them exploded outward in a shower of glass. Dark figures appeared in the frame, but Sarah didn't look back. She hit the alley running, Marcus's labored breathing beside her as they fled into the maze of downtown streets. Behind them, she could hear car engines starting, the squeal of tires on asphalt. The hunt had begun in earnest, and Sarah realized she had stumbled onto something far more dangerous than political corruption. The Greymoor family was ready to kill to protect their monstrous legacy. The elevator climbed 23 floors in silence, Sarah's reflection multiplying endlessly in the polished steel doors. Marcus Greymoor's law firm occupied the top 3 floors of the Meridian Tower, a glass and steel monument to corporate power that pierced the Seattle skyline like a crystal dagger. She'd called ahead, using her press credentials to secure a meeting under the pretense of writing a piece about political dynasties in the Pacific Northwest. The receptionist, a woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun, guided Sarah through corridors lined with oil portraits of distinguished men who shared the same pale eyes and sharp cheekbones. The family resemblance was uncanny, almost unsettling in its consistency. Sarah found herself studying each face, noting how the features seemed to intensify rather than dilute across generations. Marcus Greymoor's corner office commanded a view of Elliott Bay, where container ships moved like toys against the grey water. He stood with his back to the door when Sarah entered, a tall man in an expensive suit that couldn't quite disguise his gaunt frame. When he turned, she suppressed a start. The photograph from her research hadn't captured the intensity of his pale blue eyes or the way his skin seemed almost translucent in the afternoon light. "Miss Chen, please sit." His voice carried the cadence of old money, each word precisely articulated. "I understand you're writing about political families. How refreshing to see a journalist interested in legacy rather than scandal." Sarah settled into the leather chair across from his mahogany desk, noting the absence of personal photographs. No family pictures, no casual snapshots, only formal portraits that could have been staged by a museum curator. The Greymoor name has appeared in Pacific Northwest politics for over a century. That's quite a legacy to maintain. My family has always believed in service. Marcus moved to a sideboard and poured amber liquid from a crystal decanter. Despite the early hour, his hands trembled slightly as he lifted the glass. "Public service runs in our blood, you might say." "Speaking of blood, I'm curious about the family tree. Your genealogy is remarkably pure. Most American families have more diverse lineages by now." The glass paused halfway to his lips. For a moment something flickered behind those pale eyes. Fear, perhaps, or calculation. We've always valued our heritage. Tradition matters, Miss Chen. In an age of constant change, some families choose to preserve what came before. Sarah leaned forward, watching his face carefully. Your cousin Elizabeth mentioned something similar when I spoke with her yesterday, about the importance of keeping the bloodline strong. She hadn't spoken to Elizabeth Greymoor, but the lie had its intended effect. Marcus set down his glass with enough force to splash whiskey onto the mahogany surface. You spoke with Elizabeth? I wasn't aware she was giving interviews. Oh, she was quite forthcoming, especially about the family's private matters. Sarah kept her voice casual, professional. She seemed particularly concerned about maintaining certain traditions, something about protecting the family's unique qualities. Marcus stood abruptly, moving to the window. His reflection in the glass looked spectral, ethereal. Elizabeth can be indiscreet. She doesn't always understand the delicate nature of public perception. What exactly might the public misperceive, Mr. Greymoor? The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Outside, clouds gathered over the sound, casting shadows across the office. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. Every old family has secrets, Miss Chen. Stories that lose their context over time become distorted. What might have been necessity once could seem unpalatable to modern sensibilities. Sarah's pulse quickened. She was close to something, could feel it in the sudden tension that filled the room. What kind of necessity? Marcus turned from the window, and in the grey light filtering through the glass, his features looked sharp enough to cut. I think this interview is over, but we've barely scratched the surface of your family's history. I'm particularly interested in the Greymoor estate records from the early 1900s. The birth and death certificates make for fascinating reading. His face went white, all blood draining from already pale cheeks. How did you... He caught himself, straightening his tie with fingers that shook visibly. I'm afraid I have another appointment. Sarah rose slowly, making a show of gathering her notes. Of course, though I should mention, I'll be visiting the estate itself tomorrow. The current residents were quite welcoming when I called. The estate is private property. His composure was cracking, desperation seeping through the cultured facade. No one lives there anymore. It's been closed for years. That's strange. Someone answered the phone, a woman with a very distinctive voice. Sarah moved toward the door, then paused. She sounded young, though she claimed to be your great-aunt Margaret. Remarkable how well-preserved the Greymoor women are. Marcus Greymoor sank into his chair, as if his strings had been cut, his pale eyes fixed on something only he could see. Sarah left him there, drowning in shadows and secrets, while thunder rumbled across Elliott Bay like a warning. The rain hammered against the windows of the Cedar Grove Public Library as Sarah hunched over a stack of genealogical records, her laptop casting a pale glow across yellowed documents. She'd been here since opening, methodically tracing the Greymoor family tree through birth certificates, marriage licenses, and death records dating back to 1847. What she'd discovered made her stomach churn. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew where to look. Generation after generation of marriages between first cousins, uncles to nieces, and in several cases, what appeared to be siblings listed under different surnames. The family had been careful, spreading their documentation across multiple counties, even different states, but the dates and locations told the real story. Sarah pulled up a scanned marriage certificate from 1923 on her laptop screen. Eleanor Greymoor, age 19, married to Thomas Ashford, age 34. On the surface, nothing unusual, but cross-referencing with birth records she'd found earlier, Thomas Ashford was listed as the son of Margaret Greymoor and William Ashford. Margaret Greymoor was Eleanor's aunt. Jesus, she whispered, printing the document. Her growing pile of evidence painted a picture of systematic genetic manipulation spanning over a century. The Greymoors hadn't just been wealthy, they'd been obsessed with keeping their bloodline pure, Consequences be damned. Her phone buzzed. Marcus's name appeared on the screen. "Find anything interesting in your dusty tomb?" His voice crackled through the speaker. "More than interesting. Horrifying. I've traced at least 15 generations of deliberate inbreeding. Marcus, some of these marriages—" She paused, checking to make sure the elderly librarian wasn't within earshot. A 16-year-old girl married to her own grandfather in 1956. They listed him under a false name, but I found his real birth certificate. Silence stretched across the line. Then, "Sarah, we need to talk. I've been digging into those political connections you mentioned. The rabbit hole goes deeper than we thought." "How deep?" 3 Supreme Court justices, 2 CIA directors, and at least 7 senators over the past 50 years. All connected to Greymoor money. And Sarah, I found something else, something that might explain why they were so desperate to control their genetics. Sarah's pen stopped moving. "What do you mean?" "Medical records. Took some creative persuasion to access them, but I found documentation from a private clinic in Switzerland. The Greymoors have been dealing with severe genetic disorders for decades. Hemophilia, psychiatric conditions, developmental disabilities, but here's the kicker. Somewhere along the line they also bred for specific traits. Enhanced cognitive abilities, perfect memory, resistance to certain diseases. The pieces clicked into place in Sarah's mind like a horrifying puzzle. They weren't just maintaining bloodline purity, they were trying to create something. A master race, essentially. And based on what I'm seeing, they might have succeeded with some members of the family. There are IQ test results here that are off the charts, physical capabilities that border on superhuman. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the library's aggressive air conditioning. She thought about Senator Patricia Greymoor's unsettling presence at the gala, those pale eyes that seemed to see straight through her. "Marcus, I think I've been made." At the charity gala last night, Patricia Greymoor approached me. She knew exactly who I was, what I was working on. She basically threatened me without saying anything overtly threatening. "Pack up, now. Meet me at the safe house." "The safe house?" "Marcus, you're being paranoid." "Am I?" "Because I just got word that Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the geneticist whose research you were planning to cite, died this morning. Car accident. Her research lab caught fire an hour later." Sarah's blood turned to ice water. Dr. Morrison had agreed to speak with her tomorrow about historical genetic manipulation among wealthy families. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. "Sarah, are you there?" She was already shoving documents into her bag, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm here, on my way out." "Take the back exit. Circle around before heading to your car. And Sarah, if you see anything unusual, anyone following you, don't go to the safe house. Go straight to the police station downtown." The line went dead. Sarah zipped her laptop bag and approached the circulation desk, forcing her voice to remain steady as she asked about photocopying policies for historical documents. The librarian, a woman in her 70s with kind eyes, smiled helpfully and began explaining the process. As they talked, Sarah noticed a black sedan pulling into the parking lot outside. 2 figures sat in the front seats, their faces obscured by the rain-streaked windshield. The car parked with a clear view of the library's main entrance. Sarah thanked the librarian and walked calmly toward the back of the building, her heart hammering against her ribs. The emergency exit led to an alley behind the library. She pushed through the heavy door, setting off a brief alarm, and stepped into the cold rain. The alley was empty except for a dumpster and her Honda Civic parked at the far end. As she hurried toward her car, she heard footsteps splashing through puddles behind her. The rain hammered against the windshield as Sarah navigated the winding road toward the Greymoor estate. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter with each mile, the anonymous caller's words echoing in her mind. "The truth is in the basement. Tonight, come alone." Every journalistic instinct screamed that this was a trap, yet here she was, driving deeper into the Massachusetts countryside, where cell towers grew sparse and streetlights disappeared entirely. The estate's iron gates loomed ahead, standing open as promised. Sarah pulled her Honda between the towering stone pillars, noting how the security cameras had been deliberately turned away from the entrance. Someone had cleared her path, but whether it was friend or foe remained terrifyingly unclear. The mansion rose like a Gothic monument against the storm-darkened sky. Built in 1847, the Greymoor estate had housed 5 generations of the family, its dark windows now staring down at her like hollow eyes. Sarah parked near a side entrance, as instructed, and checked her phone one last time. No signal. She was truly on her own. The key was exactly where the caller had said it would be, beneath a loose stone near the servants' entrance. Sarah's heart pounded as she turned it in the lock, the door opening with barely a whisper. Inside, emergency lighting cast eerie shadows along corridors lined with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors. The Greymoor family tree stretched back through centuries of American power, their influence woven into the fabric of politics, business, and society. Following the caller's directions, Sarah made her way through the mansion's labyrinthine lower level. The air grew colder as she descended, carrying the musty scent of age and something else, something organic and unsettling. Her phone's flashlight beam danced ahead of her, revealing stone walls that seemed far older than the house above. The basement door stood ajar, and beyond it lay darkness that seemed to swallow her light. Sarah hesitated, every survival instinct urging her to flee. But the journalist in her won out. Too many threads led to this family: the missing persons reports, the covered-up scandals, the political favors that defied explanation. If answers waited in that darkness, she had to find them. The basement was vast, extending far beyond what the mansion's footprint should have allowed. Ancient stone columns supported the ceiling, and along the walls, Sarah discovered something that made her blood freeze: photographs, hundreds of them, dating back more than a century. But these weren't family portraits. They were documentation, clinical, methodical records of births, deaths, and unions that painted a horrifying picture. The Greymoors hadn't just maintained their wealth and power through traditional means. They had bred for it, keeping their bloodline closed, their genes concentrated. Sarah's trembling hands traced the genealogical charts that mapped generations of cousins marrying cousins, uncles taking nieces as wives, siblings producing children who bore the telltale signs of severe inbreeding. But the photographs revealed something worse. Those who were born too damaged, too obviously marked by their corrupted heritage, had been eliminated. Sarah found meticulous records of corrections and adjustments spanning decades. Children who disappeared from birth records, young adults who vanished from family trees, all documented with the cold efficiency of a eugenics program. A sound from above made her freeze. Footsteps, deliberate and measured, moving through the house. Sarah killed her flashlight and pressed herself against the stone wall, heart hammering so loudly she was certain it could be heard throughout the basement. The footsteps paused directly overhead, then began moving toward the basement entrance. She grabbed what documents she could, stuffing photographs and papers into her jacket. The evidence was overwhelming. Not just the inbreeding, but the murders, the systematic elimination of unfit family members, and records showing how they had used their influence to cover it up. Police reports had been buried, coroner's findings altered, and witnesses relocated or worse. The footsteps were on the basement stairs now. Sarah spotted another exit, a narrow passage that likely led to the old root cellar. She slipped into it just as light flooded the main basement chamber. Through a gap in the stone, she watched a figure in an expensive suit survey the scattered documents, his face calm despite the chaos. "Miss Chen," a cultured voice called out, echoing off the stone walls. "I know you're here. There's no need to hide. We have so much to discuss." Sarah recognized the voice from news interviews, Senator William Greymoor, the family's current political face. His tone was conversational, almost friendly, but she had seen enough in those photographs to know the monster behind the public facade. She pressed deeper into the narrow passage, feeling her way along the damp stone walls. Behind her, the senator's footsteps began to follow, methodical and patient. He wasn't chasing her, he was hunting her, confident that his prey had nowhere to run. The passage opened into a wider chamber, and Sarah's flashlight revealed something that nearly made her scream. Bodies, mummified by the cool, dry air, arranged in neat rows like a catalogue of the family's darkest shame. The basement wasn't just a record room. It was a tomb. The fluorescent lights in the Millbrook Public Library cast an sickly pallor over Sarah's face as she hunched over a microfilm reader, scrolling through decades-old newspaper archives. Her eyes burned from hours of searching, but she couldn't stop now. Every instinct told her she was close to something massive. The anonymous tip had led her here, to this small Connecticut town where the Greymoor family had maintained a summer estate for over a century. What she'd found so far made her stomach churn. Birth records with suspicious gaps, death certificates with vague causes, marriage licenses that revealed a disturbing pattern of unions between cousins, second cousins, and distant relatives who shared the same twisted bloodline. She paused on a 1952 newspaper headline, "Tragedy strikes prominent family. Greymoor heir dies in hunting accident." The accompanying photo showed a young man with the characteristic Greymoor features, pale eyes, sharp cheekbones, and an almost ethereal quality that spoke of generations of careful breeding. Too careful. Sarah cross-referenced the date with her genealogy charts. Thomas Greymoor III, age 19, shot dead 2 weeks before his engagement to a senator's daughter was to be announced. The same senator who would later champion legislation that made the Greymoor shipping empire billions. Her phone buzzed. "Unknown number. You're getting warm," the distorted voice said when she answered. "But you're also getting noticed." "Who is this?" Sarah whispered, glancing around the empty library. "Someone who escaped." Check the psychiatric records. Blackwood Sanitarium, 1978 to 1982. Patient files were supposed to be destroyed, but the line went dead. Sarah's hands trembled as she saved her research and packed up. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, approached as she gathered her things. "Finding everything you need, dear?" she asked, but something in her expression seemed forced. "You've been asking a lot of questions about the Greymoors." "Just doing some genealogy research," Sarah lied smoothly. The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Funny thing about genealogy, sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie. The Greymoors, well, they've been good to this town. Very good. We wouldn't want anyone spreading nasty rumors." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah nodded politely and left, feeling eyes on her back as she walked to her rental car. She drove aimlessly for 20 minutes, checking her mirrors constantly before pulling into a diner on the outskirts of town. Blackwood Sanitarium had been demolished in 1985, but Sarah's investigative contacts ran deep. A few phone calls later, she had the name of a former orderly who might talk, for the right price. Eddie Malone lived in a trailer park 40 miles away, surviving on disability and bourbon. When Sarah knocked on his door, he answered with rheumy eyes and a suspicious scowl. "You're the journalist who's been sniffing around the Greymoors," he said before she could introduce herself. "Word travels fast in these parts." "I'll pay for information," Sarah said bluntly. "Real information." Eddie studied her for a long moment, then stepped aside. The trailer reeked of cigarettes and despair. Empty bottles cluttered every surface, and the walls were covered with newspaper clippings about various conspiracy theories. But Eddie's eyes, despite the alcohol, held a sharp intelligence. "I worked at Blackwood for 7 years, he began, settling into a stained recliner. "Saw things that would make your skin crawl. The Greymoors, they had their own wing. Private patients, family members who didn't quite fit the mold." Sarah pulled out her recorder. "What kind of patients?" "The ones who talked too much. The ones who couldn't handle what the family did to maintain their precious bloodline." Eddie's voice dropped to a whisper. "There was this girl, Emily Greymoor, brought in when she was 16, kept there until she was 20. Pretty thing, but her mind was broken. Used to scream about her uncle, about things he made her do, about babies that disappeared." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What happened to her?" "Official story? Suicide. Hung herself in her room." Eddie laughed bitterly. "But I was on shift that night. Heard men's voices in the wing, expensive shoes clicking on linoleum. Next morning, Emily was dead, and there was a new Cadillac in the parking lot with government plates. Do you have any proof? Eddie disappeared into his bedroom and returned with a manila envelope. Kept some files when they shut the place down. Insurance, you might say. Emily's not the only one who died in that wing. Pattern going back decades. Greymoor family members who knew too much, caused too much trouble, threatened to expose the family's methods of keeping the bloodline pure. Sarah opened the envelope with shaking hands. Medical records, death certificates, and photographs of young men and women who all shared the distinctive Greymoor features. All dead before age 25. All officially suicides or accidents. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. Eddie's eyes hardened. "Because some secrets are too big to stay buried, and because they killed my daughter." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Eddie's face crumpled with grief and rage as he continued. She was a nurse there. Started asking questions about the Greymoor patients. "Car accident on a perfectly clear night," they said, "but I know better." The abandoned textile mill squatted against the Connecticut skyline like a monument to decay. Sarah checked her watch. 11:47 p.m. Marcus would be here any moment with the backup files from his newspaper's morgue. She'd insisted on meeting somewhere the Greymoors couldn't anticipate, somewhere their influence hadn't yet spread its poisonous tendrils. Inside the mill, moonlight filtered through broken windows, casting geometric shadows across the factory floor. Sarah's footsteps echoed hollowly as she made her way to the agreed-upon meeting spot near the old loading dock. The smell of rust and mold hung heavy in the air, mixing with something else, something metallic that made her stomach clench. A phone buzzed. A text from Marcus, running late. Traffic. Be there in 20. 20 minutes alone in this place. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter and tried to focus on organizing her thoughts. The birth certificates she'd photographed at the records office painted a disturbing picture. 3 generations of Greymoor marriages between first cousins, uncle to niece, patterns that would make any geneticist's blood run cold. No wonder the family had worked so hard to bury their genealogical records. But it was the medical files that truly horrified her. Dr. Elizabeth Whitmore's notes described a litany of genetic disorders plaguing the Greymoor bloodline, skeletal deformities, cognitive impairments, and something the doctor had cryptically referred to as violent predispositions manifesting in subjects 2A through IE. Sarah had cross-referenced those designations with the family tree. They corresponded to 5 Greymoor cousins born between 1995 and 2001, including Jonathan Greymoor, currently being groomed for a Senate run. A sound from deeper in the mill made her freeze. Not Marcus. She would have heard his car. This was something else, a scraping noise like metal against concrete. Sarah reached for her phone's flashlight but hesitated. Light would give away her position. "Hello?" she called softly, then immediately regretted it. The scraping stopped. Sarah's heart hammered as she strained to listen. The mill felt different now, as if the very air had thickened with malevolent intent. She began backing toward the exit, her feet finding the path by memory. 3 steps. 5. 10. Her back hit something solid that definitely hadn't been there before. "Ms. Chen." The voice was cultured, almost gentle. "You've been very difficult to find." Sarah spun around to face a tall man in an expensive overcoat. Even in the dim light, she recognized him from the society pages. Charles Greymoor III, patriarch of the family and Jonathan's grandfather. But seeing him in person was different. There was something wrong with his proportions, his left shoulder sitting noticeably higher than his right, his fingers unnaturally long. "Mr. Greymoor." Sarah forced her voice to remain steady. "I wasn't expecting a personal visit." "No, I imagine you weren't." His smile revealed teeth that seemed to have too many angles. "Though after your little adventure at the county records office, we felt a more direct approach was warranted." Sarah's hand inched toward her pocket, where she kept a small canister of pepper spray. "We?" Movement in the shadows answered her question. 2 more figures emerged from behind machinery. a woman with stringy grey hair and a younger man whose face seemed to shift strangely in the moonlight. Both shared the family's distinctive sharp cheekbones and that same unsettling wrongness in their proportions. "My daughter Catherine," Charles said, indicating the woman, "and my great-nephew Timothy. We thought it appropriate to keep this a family matter." Catherine stepped closer, and Sarah could see her eyes gleaming with an unhealthy intensity. "She knows about the bloodline," she said, her voice carrying a strange musical quality. "I can smell it on her." "Indeed." Charles began circling Sarah like a predator sizing up prey. "You've been very thorough, Miss Chen. Medical records, birth certificates, even old police reports about those unfortunate accidents involving family members who grew too unstable." Sarah's mouth went dry. "What accidents?" "Oh, there have been several over the years. The bloodline, while it grants certain advantages, occasionally produces individuals who cannot properly channel their gifts. They become liabilities." His smile widened, much like investigative journalists who dig too deeply into matters that don't concern them. Timothy moved to block the exit, and Sarah realized with crystal clarity that she was going to die in this place. The Greymoors hadn't come to threaten or negotiate, they'd come to eliminate a problem. "The thing is," Charles continued conversationally, "we've survived for over a century by understanding that sometimes sacrifices must be made. Sometimes the weak must be culled to preserve the strong." Sarah's hand closed around the pepper spray just as Catherine lunged forward with inhuman speed. The woman's fingernails had grown into claws, and her face had contorted into something barely recognizable as human. Sarah sprayed wildly, hearing Catherine shriek as the chemical hit her eyes. She bolted toward a broken window, glass crunching under her feet. Behind her, Charles was laughing, a sound like breaking bones. "Run, little journalist," he called after her, "but understand that you can never run far enough. The Greymoor Reach extends everywhere, and we never forget our enemies." Sarah crashed through the window into the Connecticut night, blood streaming from a dozen cuts, knowing she had, perhaps, minutes before they followed. The abandoned Greymoor textile mill loomed against the storm-darkened sky like a monument to decay. Sarah pulled her coat tighter as she approached the rusted gates, Marcus close behind her. The anonymous message had been specific: 3rd floor, northwest corner. "Come alone, but you won't be—" "This feels like every horror movie cliché rolled into one," Marcus muttered, his camera equipment jangling softly in his bag. Sarah didn't disagree, but the promise of answers outweighed her fear. The mill had been shuttered for 30 years, ever since the Greymoors had moved their operations overseas. Local rumors claimed it was haunted, but Sarah suspected those stories were deliberately cultivated to keep people away. The lock on the main entrance had been recently cut. Sarah pushed the heavy door open, wincing at the shriek of metal on metal. Inside, the air hung thick with dust and something else, something organic and sour that made her stomach turn. Their flashlight beams carved through the darkness, revealing the skeletal remains of machinery draped in cobwebs. Water dripped steadily from holes in the roof, creating an irregular percussion that echoed through the vast space. "Sarah," Marcus grabbed her arm, pointing his light toward a stairwell. "Look!" Fresh footprints marked the dusty floor leading upward. Someone had been here recently. Multiple someones. They climbed in silence, their footsteps muffled by years of accumulated grime. On the 2nd floor, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. The dust patterns weren't random. They showed signs of regular disturbance, as if this place saw frequent use despite its abandoned appearance. The 3rd floor reeked of chemicals and something far worse. Sarah covered her nose with her sleeve as they made their way toward the northwest corner. Here, the darkness seemed absolute until Marcus's flashlight beam fell across a section of wall that looked different from the rest. "It's newer," he whispered. "See how the bricks don't match?" Sarah ran her fingers along the mortar. It was definitely recent construction, probably within the last decade. But why wall off part of an abandoned building? A sound from behind them made them both freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing up from the stairwell they'd just climbed. "We need to find another way out." Sarah breathed. Marcus swung his light around, revealing a service ladder bolted to the far wall. But as they moved toward it, Sarah's foot caught something metallic. She looked down to see a small brass plate set into the floor. When she knelt to examine it, her heart nearly stopped. The plate bore the Greymoor family crest, but beneath it was an inscription: Margaret Greymoor, 1987 to 2003, a name that shouldn't exist because, according to all public records, no Margaret Greymoor had died in 2003. "Marcus," she whispered urgently, "there are more." Her flashlight revealed a grid of similar plates, dozens of them, each bearing names and dates spanning decades. All Greymoors, all dead young, all absent from any official records. The footsteps on the stairs grew closer. "They're coming," Marcus hissed. But Sarah couldn't move. She was photographing the plates with her phone, her journalist's instincts overriding her survival instincts. Thomas Greymoor, 1962 to 1978. Elizabeth Greymoor, 1945 to 1960. Jonathan Greymoor, 1989 to 2008. Children. They were all children, and they'd all died young. The implications crashed over Sarah like a cold wave. The inbreeding hadn't just produced the violent tendencies and political corruption they'd already uncovered. It had produced something worse. Children so genetically damaged they couldn't survive. Children whose existence had been erased from all official records. But why memorialize them here, in this awful place? The answer came when Marcus's flashlight beam fell across the newer brick wall. At its base, the mortar was stained dark brown. Not water damage, blood. "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed. "Sarah, they're not just buried somewhere else. They're behind that wall." The footsteps reached their floor. Multiple sets now, moving with purpose through the maze of machinery below. Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm and pulled him toward the service ladder. As they climbed toward what she hoped was roof access, her mind raced. The Greymoors hadn't just hidden their damaged offspring, they'd killed them and entombed them in the family's industrial monument. Generations of murdered children, their only memorial these hidden brass plates in a building no one was supposed to enter. Behind them, flashlight beams swept across the floor they'd just vacated. Voices echoed in the darkness, too distant to make out words but close enough to convey menace. The ladder led to a rusted door that opened onto the mill's roof. Rain lashed their faces as they emerged into the storm, but Sarah felt a surge of relief. They were alive, and they had evidence, not just of corruption or violence, but of something far worse: systematic infanticide spanning generations. As they made their way across the treacherous roof toward a fire escape on the building's far side, Sarah realized the true scope of what they'd uncovered. The Greymoors hadn't just committed crimes, they'd created their own private Holocaust, hidden in plain sight for decades. But now someone wanted it exposed. The question was, who had led them here, and why? The grandfather clock in the Greymoor mansion's foyer chimed midnight as Elias descended the curved staircase, his leather shoes silent against the Persian runner. The house breathed around him with familiar sounds: settling timber, distant wind through the eaves, the soft whisper of forced air through century-old ducts. He'd grown up with these sounds, learned to read them like a native language. Tonight, they told him someone was inside who shouldn't be. Sarah pressed herself deeper into the alcove behind the massive oak armoire, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give her away. She'd been photographing documents in what appeared to be Elias's study when she'd heard the front door. Now, clutching her camera bag, she watched his shadow stretch across the marble floor as he paused at the bottom of the stairs. "I know you're here," Elias said conversationally, his voice carrying the cultured accent that marked 3 generations of Ivy League education. "The alarm system is quite sophisticated, silent but effective." Sarah's mouth went dry. She'd been so careful, following Marcus's instructions about the security bypass to the letter. Unless... "My dear cousin was always too trusting," Elias continued, moving toward the study. "Did you really think Marcus would help you without telling me? He's been reporting your every move since that first phone call." The betrayal hit her like cold water. Marcus, with his nervous energy and apparent guilt, had been playing her from the beginning. Sarah's mind raced through every detail she'd shared with him, every piece of evidence she'd revealed. He'd fed it all back to Elias. "The documents you've been photographing tonight are quite interesting, aren't they?" Elias stepped into the study, and Sarah heard him settling into the leather chair behind the massive desk. Birth certificates with falsified dates, death records that don't quite match the headstones in our family cemetery, marriage licenses between relatives who officially never existed. Sarah's hands trembled as she reviewed the images on her camera's display. She'd captured enough evidence to expose decades of systematic fraud. Children born to siblings and cousins, their lineage carefully obscured through forged documents and strategic adoptions. The Greymoor family tree was a twisted spiral, folding back on itself in ways that defied both law and nature. "But you're missing the really fascinating part," Elias called out, his voice closer now. "The why of it all. Would you like to know why we've spent so much effort preserving our bloodline?" Despite her terror, Sarah found herself listening. This was what she'd come for, the truth behind the elaborate deception. "My great-great-grandfather discovered something remarkable during his time in the Philippines, a genetic anomaly that runs in our family. A form of enhanced pattern recognition, you might say. The ability to see connections others miss, to predict outcomes with uncanny accuracy. It made him extraordinarily wealthy. It made us extraordinarily powerful." Sarah thought of the Greymoor Empire, banking, media, politics, technology, always one step ahead of the market, always backing the right candidates, always positioning themselves perfectly for the next economic shift. "But the trait is recessive," Elias continued. "It requires concentrated breeding to maintain. Each generation we risk losing it entirely unless we're very careful about our choices." The photographs she'd taken suddenly made horrible sense. Children born to maintain a genetic advantage, marriages arranged not for love or even political alliance, but to preserve an inherited form of intelligence that bordered on prescience. The murders you've been investigating, those were quality control, you might say. Family members who threatened to dilute the bloodline through outside relationships, or who began to exhibit the unfortunate side effects of our genetic heritage. Sarah pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. She'd seen references in the documents to family members committed to private institutions, others who died in mysterious accidents. The Greymoors weren't just inbred, they were selectively culled. "Mental instability runs parallel to the enhanced cognition," Elias explained, his footsteps moving around the study with the casual confidence of someone completely in control. "Paranoia, violent tendencies, profound antisocial behavior. We've learned to identify these traits early and address them before they become problematic." A floorboard creaked directly behind Sarah's hiding place. She turned slowly to find Elias standing there, impeccably dressed despite the late hour, his pale eyes reflecting the moonlight streaming through the tall windows. "The question now," he said, pulling a small pistol from his jacket pocket, "is which category you fall into. You've certainly demonstrated enhanced pattern recognition tonight, seeing connections my family spent considerable effort to hide, but you've also made some remarkably poor decisions." Sarah clutched her camera bag tighter. The evidence inside was damning enough to destroy the Greymoor Empire, but only if she lived long enough to publish it. "Shall we take a walk to the family cemetery?" Elias asked politely. "I think it's time you met the rest of my relatives." The abandoned Greymoor textile mill squatted against the moonless sky like a diseased tumor, its broken windows gaping like sightless eyes. Sarah's hands trembled as she adjusted her camera strap and checked her recorder one final time. The anonymous message had been specific: Sub-level 3, midnight, come alone. Every instinct screamed this was a trap, but the promise of documentation proving the family's genetic experiments had overridden her survival instincts. Marcus had insisted on coming despite her protests, positioning himself as lookout while she descended into the bowels of the building. The rusty service elevator groaned ominously as it carried her down past levels that shouldn't exist, deeper than any mill would ever need to go. The air grew thick and stale, carrying an underlying sweetness that made her stomach churn. The elevator shuddered to a halt with a grinding screech. Sarah stepped into a corridor lit by flickering fluorescent lights that cast everything in a sickly green pallor. The walls were lined with institutional tile, cracked and stained with substances she didn't want to identify. Her footsteps echoed hollowly as she followed the numbered doors deeper into the facility. Room 347 stood slightly ajar. Sarah pushed it open with her elbow, keeping her hands free for her camera. The space beyond defied comprehension. Medical equipment from different eras crowded together in nightmarish harmony. Victorian surgical tables beside modern incubators, antique syringes next to contemporary genetic sequencing machines. But it was the photographs covering the walls that made her blood freeze. Hundreds of images documented generations of Greymoor offspring. The earlier photos showed relatively normal-looking children, but as the timeline progressed, the effects of systematic inbreeding became grotesquely apparent. Twisted spines, malformed limbs, faces that barely qualified as human. Yet interspersed among the failures were others, beautiful, perfect specimens with an otherworldly quality that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Magnificent, isn't it?" The voice made her spin around, heart hammering. Evelyn Greymoor stood in the doorway, no longer the elegant society matron, but something far more terrible. Her eyes held the flat, predatory gleam of a snake, and her smile revealed teeth filed to subtle points. "The public sees our failures and thinks we're monsters," Evelyn continued, gliding into the room. "They don't understand that every great scientific advance requires sacrifice. We've been perfecting humanity while they breed like animals, diluting their bloodlines with inferior stock." Sarah's finger found the camera's shutter button. "You've been murdering your own children, disposing of the ones who didn't meet your twisted standards. Culling the weak to strengthen the herd. Darwin would approve." Evelyn ran her finger along one of the surgical tables. "Did you know we've isolated the genetic markers for psychic sensitivity, for enhanced intelligence, for longevity that spans centuries? The Greymoor line will evolve beyond human limitations, while the rest of your species stumbles toward extinction." The camera clicked rapidly as Sarah documented everything. "What about Judge Morrison, Senator Bradley? How many politicians are part of your breeding program?" Evelyn's laugh was like breaking glass. "You still don't understand the scope, do you? This isn't just about politics. We've placed our bloodline in every institution that matters: courts, media, military, corporations. Your precious democracy is an illusion. We've been guiding humanity's development for over a century." A new voice cut through the room like a blade. "She's documented enough, Evelyn." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Marcus stood in the doorway, but his familiar features now wore an expression of cold calculation she'd never seen before. The concern in his eyes had been replaced by something reptilian and ancient. "Marcus?" Her voice came out as a broken whisper. "My apologies, Sarah. I genuinely enjoyed our time together." He stepped into the room, moving with fluid grace that seemed wrong somehow. But family comes first. The resemblance hit her like a physical blow. The same bone structure as Evelyn, the same predatory stillness, the same inhuman perfection she'd noticed in the later photographs. "You've been watching me from the beginning." The words tasted like ashes. "Guiding you, actually. We needed someone credible to document certain obsolete elements of our operation, someone who could help us identify which family members had become liabilities." Marcus's smile was gentle, almost apologetic. "Your investigation gave us the perfect opportunity for internal housekeeping." Sarah's mind raced as pieces fell into place. Every source Marcus had suggested, every lead he'd helped her follow, it had all been orchestrated. She hadn't been investigating the Greymoors. She'd been their unwitting executioner, marking their own family members for elimination. "The beauty of it," Evelyn said, "is that your articles will actually strengthen our position. A few sacrificial lambs, a scandal that touches only the expendable branches of our tree, and the public will think justice has been served. Sarah's finger was still on the camera's shutter button. She had one chance, one final story to tell. But as she looked at Marcus, at the thing wearing Marcus's face, she realized that some truths were too terrible for the world to bear, and some monsters too powerful to ever truly expose. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously overhead, and in the distance, she could hear the sound of footsteps approaching. The basement of the Greymoor estate stretched deeper than Sarah had imagined possible, its stone corridors branching into darkness, like the arteries of some massive buried heart. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something organic and wrong that made her stomach clench. Marcus moved ahead of her, his flashlight beam dancing across walls lined with portraits. Even in the wavering light, Sarah could see the faces were wrong. The same pale eyes, the same sharp cheekbones, but distorted somehow. Children with adult expressions, adults with the slack features of developmental delays. A woman whose beauty was marred by a cleft palate that had never been repaired, her smile frozen in oil paint like a wound. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, stopping before a family tree carved directly into the stone. Names and dates spiraled inward in concentric circles, lines connecting parents to children to grandchildren in patterns that hurt to follow. Sarah traced one bloodline with her finger and watched it loop back on itself again and again. "Look at this," she breathed. Thomas Greymoor married his own niece in 1847. Their son Edmund wed his half-sister. It just keeps going, Marcus, generation after generation. The sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere behind them, distant but growing closer. They pressed deeper into the tunnels, past alcoves filled with medical equipment that belonged in a museum, restraints, surgical instruments, devices whose purpose Sarah didn't want to contemplate. They found the records room behind a door marked with symbols that predated any language Sarah recognized. Inside, filing cabinets lined the walls from floor to ceiling, meticulously organized and maintained. Marcus pulled out a drawer labeled 1920 to 1940, while Sarah opened one marked medical observations. The files inside made her blood turn to ice water. Birth certificates with impossible parentage, death certificates falsified to hide the truth, medical records documenting the systematic elimination of defective specimens, children born with too many genetic abnormalities to be allowed to live. "They kept breeding records," Marcus said, his voice barely audible. "Like livestock. Look at this. Subject 23, significant cranial deformity terminated at birth. Parents to attempt reproduction again following genetic consultation." Sarah's hands shook as she photographed page after page. The Greymoors hadn't just been practicing incest. They'd been conducting a century-long genetic experiment, trying to concentrate some specific trait in their bloodline while eliminating what they considered flaws. The rejected offspring weren't hidden away or institutionalized, they were simply deleted from existence. A newspaper clipping fell from one of the files, yellowed with age. Sarah recognized the headline immediately, "Senator's son dies in tragic accident," but the accompanying medical report told a different story. The boy had been born with severe cognitive disabilities, the result of his parents' shared great-grandfather. The accident had been anything but. "We need to get out of here," Marcus said, but Sarah was already moving toward another section of files. These were more recent, dating back only 20 years. Inside, she found photographs that made her stomach revolt. Children strapped to gurneys, surgical procedures performed without anesthesia, brain tissue samples labeled with dates and genetic markers. The Greymoors hadn't stopped their experiments in the modern era, they'd simply moved them underground and made them more sophisticated. "Sarah," Marcus's voice was tight with fear. "We need to leave, now." The footsteps were closer, accompanied by voices speaking in low, measured tones. Sarah grabbed a handful of the most damning files and stuffed them into her jacket. As they turned to flee, her flashlight beam caught something that stopped her cold. A surgical table in the center of the room, still stained with something dark. Fresh flowers sat in a vase beside it. Lilies, pristine white against the gore-stained metal. Someone had been using this room recently. The voices were in the corridor now, close enough that Sarah could make out words. The journalist is here somewhere. Find her before she sees too much. Too late for that, Sarah thought as they ran through the tunnels, her mind reeling with the implications of what they'd discovered. The Greymoors weren't just covering up historical crimes, they were still committing them. The genetic experimentation, the systematic murder of defective children, the careful breeding program designed to create some idealized version of their bloodline. It was all still happening. They reached the stairs as lights flooded the basement behind them. Sarah could hear at least 3 sets of footsteps giving chase, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who knew these tunnels intimately. She clutched the stolen files against her chest as they climbed, each step bringing them closer to the surface and whatever fresh horrors waited above. The basement had shown her the Greymoors' past sins. Now she had to survive long enough to expose their present ones and stop whatever they had planned for the future. The mansion's basement stretched far deeper than Sarah had imagined possible. Marcus led her through a maze of stone corridors that seemed carved from the bedrock itself, their footsteps echoing in the suffocating darkness. Emergency lighting cast sickly yellow pools every 20 feet, revealing walls that wept with moisture and age. "How far does this go?" Sarah whispered, her voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. "The tunnels connect to the old mine shafts," Marcus replied without looking back. "Great-grandfather had them expanded during Prohibition, then again during the Cold War. The families always believed in having options. They descended another flight of carved stone steps, the air growing thicker with each level. Sarah's chest tightened, claustrophobia clawing at her throat. The walls here were different, older, rougher, as if they'd predated the mansion above by decades. Marcus stopped at a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bands. From his pocket, he produced an ornate skeleton key that looked like something from a Gothic novel. The lock turned with a grinding sound that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth itself. "Before we go in," Marcus said, his hand frozen on the door handle, "you need to understand something. What you're about to see, it changes you. There's no going back to who you were before you knew this existed." Sarah met his eyes in the dim light. "I crossed that line the moment I started investigating your family." Marcus nodded grimly and pushed open the door. The chamber beyond defied comprehension. It was vast, easily the size of a cathedral, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadow. But it wasn't the scale that made Sarah's blood freeze, it was what filled the space. Portraits lined the walls from floor to ceiling, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, stretching back through centuries of Greymoor history. At first glance, they appeared to be a standard gallery of family ancestors. But as Sarah's eyes adjusted to the light from the antique chandeliers, the horror became apparent. The faces were wrong, subtly, grotesquely wrong in ways that spoke to generations of carefully orchestrated inbreeding. Eyes set too close together or too far apart, jaws that protruded at unnatural angles, hands with too many fingers or not enough, and in every portrait, without exception, the same pale, watery blue eyes that seemed to follow her movement through the room. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed, pulling out her phone to document what she was seeing. "How many generations?" "7, that we can verify through records," Marcus said, his voice hollow. "But the oral histories suggest it goes back much further, to the original settlement in the 1700s. Sarah moved deeper into the chamber, her camera capturing frame after frame. Near the far wall, she found a section that made her stomach lurch. These weren't just portraits of the living. They were death masks, dozens of them, displayed like trophies, each bearing a small placard with dates and what appeared to be medical notations. "Subject expired at 14 months due to respiratory complications," she read aloud from one placard. "Neural tube defects, incompatible with life." Another, terminated at birth by family physician. Severe cranial malformation. "They kept records," Marcus explained, approaching a massive oak table in the center of the chamber. Detailed breeding charts, genetic tracking, medical observations. They thought they were conducting scientific research, improving the bloodline. The table was covered with leather-bound ledgers, their pages yellow with age. Sarah opened one at random and found herself staring at hand-drawn family trees that looked more like livestock breeding charts. Careful notations tracked which unions produced acceptable offspring and which resulted in what the records coldly termed failures. "This is monstrous," Sarah whispered, photographing page after page. They were treating their own children like laboratory specimens. "It gets worse," Marcus said, leading her to a section of the wall where newer portraits hung. Sarah recognized several faces from newspaper photos and television appearances. Current senators, federal judges, corporate executives, all bearing the telltale signs of the Greymoor genetic legacy, though more subtly than their ancestors. "The breeding program never stopped," Marcus continued. "It just became more sophisticated. They started bringing in carefully selected outsiders, people with specific genetic profiles that could strengthen the line while maintaining the core bloodline. They'd seduce them, marry them, and then—" He gestured to a display case containing what appeared to be medical instruments from different eras. Some looked like primitive surgical tools, others were clearly more modern. "And then eliminate them once they'd served their purpose," Sarah finished, the full scope of the horror finally becoming clear. "How many people are we talking about? Hundreds, maybe thousands over the centuries. Spouses, lovers, their own children who didn't meet the genetic standards, anyone who threatened to expose the truth." Sarah's hands shook as she continued documenting. This wasn't just a story about political corruption or even murder. This was evidence of a systematic campaign of genetic manipulation and elimination that had been operating in the shadows of American power for generations. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. Marcus turned to face her, and in his pale eyes she saw something she hadn't expected, genuine remorse. "Because it has to end," he said simply, "and you're the only one who can stop it." The abandoned Greymoor estate loomed against the storm clouds like a festering wound in the Virginia countryside. Sarah's hands trembled as she parked Detective Morrison's unmarked car behind a grove of skeletal oak trees, their branches clawing at the darkening sky. The anonymous caller's voice still echoed in her mind. "The truth is in the basement. Come alone, or she dies." Marcus had insisted on coming despite the warning. They'd lost contact with Rebecca 3 hours ago, her last transmission cutting off mid-sentence as she'd described finding something in the family archives. Now, as lightning illuminated the mansion's broken windows and crumbling facade, Sarah wondered if they were walking into a trap. "Motion sensors are dark," Marcus whispered, checking his phone's heat signature app. "And either the power's been cut, or someone wants us to think the place is empty." Sarah shouldered her camera bag, its weight reassuring against her ribs. Inside, along with her equipment, lay the USB drive containing everything they'd uncovered about the Greymoor bloodline. Generations of calculated marriages, strategic murders, and the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened their genetic legacy. If something happened to them tonight, at least the evidence would survive. The front door stood ajar, creaking on rusted hinges. The smell hit them immediately, decay mixed with something chemical, antiseptic. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a grand foyer stripped of its former glory. Portraits hung askew on water-stained walls, their subjects' eyes seeming to track their movement. Every face bore the distinctive Greymoor features: pale skin, sharp cheekbones, and those unsettling blue eyes that seemed to see too much. "Sarah." Marcus's voice was barely audible. He pointed toward the floor where fresh footprints marked the dust, at least 3 sets, leading deeper into the house. They followed the trail through a maze of abandoned rooms. Sarah's camera captured everything. Documents scattered across mahogany tables, medical files dating back to the 1920s, genealogy charts that revealed the true scope of the family's inbreeding. In what had once been a library, she found children's photographs pinned to corkboards, dozens of them, with red X's marked across the faces of those who hadn't met the family's genetic standards. A sound from below made them freeze, voices, muffled but urgent, drifting up through the floorboards. Marcus drew his weapon as they searched for stairs leading to the basement. They found them hidden behind a panel in the kitchen, the wooden steps descending into absolute darkness. The basement was larger than the house's footprint should have allowed, carved deep into the bedrock beneath the estate. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting everything in sickly green shadows. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and glass cases containing what looked like medical specimens. At the far end, a heavy steel door stood partially open. Rebecca's voice carried through the opening, strained but defiant. "You can't hide this forever. People know the truth now." "People have suspected for decades," came the reply. A woman's voice, cultured and cold. "Suspicion is meaningless without proof. And proof, my dear, is remarkably easy to eliminate." Sarah recognized the speaker as she crept closer to the doorway. Victoria Greymoor Ashworth, the family's current matriarch and a federal appeals court judge. Through the gap, Sarah could see Rebecca bound to a chair in what appeared to be a medical examination room. Victoria stood beside her, elegant even in this nightmarish setting, wearing surgical gloves and holding a syringe filled with clear liquid. "The bloodline must be preserved," Victoria continued, her tone conversational. "For over a century, we've maintained our genetic superiority through careful selection. Yes, it required difficult choices. Yes, some were sacrificed for the greater good. But look what we've achieved. Senators, judges, business leaders who've shaped America's destiny. A few unfortunate deaths are a small price for such influence." Marcus stepped into view, his gun trained on Victoria. Federal agent, drop the syringe and step away from the hostage. Victoria smiled, an expression that never reached her eyes. "Detective Morrison, we've been expecting you." She nodded toward the shadows, and two figures emerged, men with the unmistakable Greymoor features, both armed. "Did you really think you were the first to discover our little family secret? We've been watching you since Miss Chen received that first anonymous tip." Sarah's blood turned to ice. The realization hit her like a physical blow. They'd been manipulated from the beginning. Someone in the family had wanted them to uncover certain truths while leading them away from others. "But why?" "The tip came from you," she whispered, stepping into the light. Victoria's smile widened. "Very good. You see, we have a problem. Certain family members have grown unstable, threatening to expose us out of misguided guilt. We needed someone to help us clean house while appearing to be the victims of an unfortunate accident." The trap was closing around them, but Sarah's mind raced with new questions. If Victoria was behind the anonymous tips, then what was she really hiding? What truth was so devastating that even murder and exposure were preferable to its revelation? The abandoned textile mill loomed against the storm-darkened sky like a monument to industrial decay. Sarah pressed herself against the rusted fire escape, rain streaming down her face as she watched Marcus position himself near the main entrance. They had 30 minutes before Detective Rivera arrived with backup, assuming her encrypted message had gotten through. Thunder masked the sound of her boots on the metal grating as she climbed toward the broken window Marcus had identified. The Greymoor family's final stronghold wasn't some grand estate. It was this crumbling relic where they once operated their legitimate business, back when the bloodline still maintained pretenses of normalcy. Inside, the air hung thick with mold and something else, something organic and wrong. Sarah's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing machinery draped in cobwebs and graffiti-covered walls. But there, in the far corner, a newer addition stood out, a reinforced steel door with electronic locks. Her heart hammered as she approached. The keypad glowed red in the darkness, waiting. Sarah pulled out her phone, scrolling to the photos she'd taken of the documents from Eleanor's hidden archive. Among the financial records and birth certificates, she'd found a sequence of numbers that appeared repeatedly. The date of the family's arrival in America, 1847. The lock clicked open. Beyond the door, Fluorescent lights flickered to life automatically, illuminating a space that made Sarah's stomach lurch. The room was part laboratory, part museum, and part shrine. Glass cases lined the walls, containing what looked like medical specimens floating in preservative fluid. Photographs covered every surface, generations of Greymoor family portraits showing the gradual degradation of their features, the increasing prominence of genetic abnormalities. At the center of it all sat a desk covered in current documents. Sarah moved closer, her camera ready, birth certificates with falsified information, medical records showing genetic counseling sessions, and most damning of all, a ledger tracking payments to politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials dating back decades. A soft footstep behind her made her blood freeze. "I was wondering when you'd find this place." Sarah turned slowly to find Victoria Greymoor standing in the doorway, but this wasn't the polished political matriarch from the television interviews. This woman's eyes held a feral intelligence, and her smile revealed teeth filed to unnatural points, a family tradition Sarah had read about in the oldest documents. "The mill has been in our family for 6 generations, Victoria continued, stepping into the room. Each generation added to the collection. My great-great-grandfather started with simple record-keeping, tracking bloodlines, ensuring purity. But as the outside world grew more intrusive, we had to become more creative." Sarah's hand moved slowly toward her phone, hoping Marcus was monitoring her location. "The murders, the cover-ups. How many people have you killed to protect your secret?" Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. "Secret? Oh, my dear child, you still don't understand. This isn't about hiding what we are. It's about preserving it. Every family needs fresh blood eventually, even ours." The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. "That's why you've been watching me, following me. Exceptional intelligence, strong investigative instincts, healthy genetic markers from your medical records. Yes, we've been very thorough." Victoria moved closer, and Sarah could see the subtle deformities that makeup had been hiding, an extra joint in her fingers, eyes that didn't quite track together. The family has always recruited new members when necessary, usually through marriage, but sometimes other arrangements. Sarah backed against the desk, her fingers finding the letter opener among the papers. "You're insane if you think I'd ever—" "You don't have a choice." Victoria's voice dropped to a whisper. "Did you really think we didn't know about your little friend outside, about the police backup that's been delayed by a very convenient traffic accident? The Greymoor influence runs deeper than you can imagine, Sarah. We've had over a century to plant our seeds in every institution that matters." The light suddenly cut out, plunging them into darkness. Sarah heard Victoria moving but couldn't tell which direction. She fumbled for her flashlight, but strong hands grabbed her wrists before she could reach it. "The integration process is quite painless," Victoria's voice came from directly behind her ear. "A few procedures to ensure compatibility. Some conditioning to help you understand your new role, and then you'll help us recruit the next generation of guardians." Sarah drove her elbow backward as hard as she could, feeling it connect with something soft. Victoria's grip loosened enough for her to break free and sprint toward the door. Behind her, she could hear pursuit, but also something else, shouting from outside the building. She burst through the steel door and into the main factory floor just as Marcus's voice echoed through the space. "Sarah, where are you?" "Here!" she screamed, running toward his voice. "She's here! Victoria's—" The gunshot echoed through the mill like thunder. Sarah felt something hot graze her shoulder as she dove behind a rusted conveyor belt. In the darkness ahead, she could see Marcus's flashlight beam sweeping back and forth, searching for her. But between them, Victoria Greymoor stood silhouetted against the broken windows, and she was no longer alone. The abandoned Greymoor estate loomed against the storm-darkened sky like a monument to decay. Sarah's hands trembled as she pushed through the rusted iron gates, their hinges screaming in protest. Behind her, Detective Marcus Rivera checked his weapon one final time, his face grim in the flickering light of their flashlights. The basement entrance should be around back, Sarah whispered, consulting the crude map that Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell had sketched before they'd lost contact with her 3 days ago. The elderly genealogist had been their final ally, the last person willing to speak about the Greymoor family's twisted history. Now she was missing, and Sarah feared the worst. They moved through the overgrown gardens where marble statues stood like sentinels, their faces eroded by decades of neglect. Yet even in their deteriorated state, Sarah could see the telltale signs, the elongated skulls, the sunken eyes, the genetic markers that had become more pronounced with each generation of carefully orchestrated inbreeding. Marcus grabbed her arm as a shadow moved past an upper window. They froze, watching, but nothing else stirred in the hulking structure. "Could be the wind," he murmured, but his grip on his gun tightened. The basement door was exactly where Dr. Hartwell had indicated, hidden beneath a tangle of dead ivy. Sarah's heart hammered as Marcus pried it open with a crowbar they'd brought. The smell that wafted up made them both gag, something sweet and putrid, like flowers left too long in a tomb. Their descent into the darkness felt like entering the mouth of some ancient beast. The stone steps were worn smooth by generations of footsteps, and Sarah couldn't help but imagine all the Greymoors who had walked this path before them, carrying their terrible secrets deeper into the earth. The basement stretched further than seemed possible, a network of chambers carved from the living rock. In the first room, they found it, Dr. Hartwell's research, scattered across makeshift tables as if she'd been working frantically before whatever happened to her occurred. Birth certificates, death records, medical files dating back to the 1800s, all documenting the systematic breeding program that had created the modern Greymoor dynasty. "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed, picking up a photograph of twins joined at the skull. "Look at this." Sarah examined the image, her stomach churning. The photograph was dated 1923 and written on the back in careful script, "Failed specimen. Disposed of per family protocol." There were dozens of similar photos, a catalogue of genetic horrors that the family had hidden from the world. But it was the modern files that truly chilled her blood. Current members of Congress, a Supreme Court justice, even a presidential candidate, all bearing the Greymoor name in their lineage, all products of the same poisoned bloodline that had been manipulating American politics for over a century. A sound echoed from deeper in the basement, a wet, rhythmic tapping like fingernails on stone. Marcus raised his weapon, motioning for Sarah to stay behind him as they moved toward the noise. The next chamber was larger, its walls lined with glass cases containing preserved specimens floating in amber fluid. Deformed fetuses, organs with impossible configurations, body parts that defied medical explanation. At the center of the room stood an ornate chair, almost throne-like, with leather restraints on the arms and legs. Dark stains covered the seat and floor around it. The tapping grew louder. In the final chamber, they found her. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell hung suspended from the ceiling by chains, her body swaying slightly in an unfelt breeze. She had been flayed with surgical precision, her skin removed in careful strips that now decorated the walls like some grotesque wallpaper. But somehow, impossibly, she was still alive. Her eyes fixed on Sarah with desperate intensity. Her mouth moved, trying to form words, but only a wet rasping emerged. Sarah stepped closer, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to run. The president," Dr. Hartwell whispered, blood frothing at her lips. "He's one of them. The genetic markers match." Before Sarah could respond, the lights went out. In the sudden darkness, she heard Marcus curse, heard his flashlight clatter to the floor. Then came another sound, footsteps on the stone stairs moving with deliberate slowness. "Welcome to the family archives, Miss Chen." The voice was cultured, aristocratic, tinged with an accent that spoke of old money and older sins. "I do hope you've found our collection educational." A circle of light suddenly blazed to life, illuminating the chamber and revealing their trap. They were surrounded by figures in surgical masks and gowns, their eyes reflecting the light like those of nocturnal predators. At their center stood a man Sarah recognized from newspaper photos, Senator William Greymoor, current patriarch of the family and rumored to be the next Secretary of State. "You've been quite persistent," he continued, removing his mask to reveal a face that bore all the hallmarks of his cursed lineage. "But every bloodline needs fresh genetic material occasionally. Welcome to your new purpose." The circle began to close. The abandoned Greymoor estate loomed against the storm-darkened sky like a monument to decay. Sarah pressed herself against the crumbling stone wall, rain streaming down her face as she clutched the encrypted hard drive containing evidence that would topple dynasties. Behind her, the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder through the thunder. Marcus emerged from the shadows of the carriage house, his FBI jacket soaked through. They'd got the main road blocked. 3 SUVs, maybe more coming from the south. His radio crackled with fragments of coordinated chatter that made Sarah's blood run cold. "How did they find us so fast?" she whispered, though she already suspected the answer. The Greymoors had tentacles everywhere, federal agencies, local police, even within Marcus's own bureau. "Someone's been feeding them information." Marcus's jaw tightened as he scanned the tree line. "We need to reach the old chapel. There's supposed to be tunnel access to the river from there." Sarah followed him across the overgrown courtyard, her feet slipping on moss-covered stones that had once welcomed senators and Supreme Court justices to the Greymoors' twisted gatherings. The Gothic windows of the main house stared down at them like dead eyes, and she couldn't shake the feeling that generations of buried secrets were watching their escape. A spotlight suddenly blazed from the mansion's upper floor, sweeping across the grounds in methodical arcs. Sarah and Marcus dove behind a collapsed fountain as the beam passed overhead, close enough that she could feel its heat on her back. There, Marcus pointed toward a smaller stone building partially hidden by overgrown ivy. "The chapel's 50 yards. We move on my count." But before he could signal, gunfire erupted from multiple positions. Bullets struck the fountain's marble rim, sending chips of stone flying like shrapnel. Sarah crawled behind Marcus toward better cover, the hard drive pressed against her chest like a talisman. "Sarah Chen!" The voice that boomed across the courtyard was cultured, aristocratic, and utterly without warmth. "You've caused our family considerable inconvenience." Through the rain, a figure emerged from the mansion's main entrance. Even at this distance, Sarah recognized Thaddeus Greymoor III from the photographs in her research. Tall, silver-haired, wearing an expensive overcoat as if this were a garden party rather than a manhunt. "Your investigation ends here," Thaddeus continued, flanked by armed men in tactical gear. "Return what belongs to us, and your death will be traditional." Marcus squeezed Sarah's shoulder. "When I lay down covering fire, you run for the chapel. Don't look back. I'm not leaving you. This isn't negotiable." His eyes held a fierce protectiveness that reminded her why she'd trusted him with everything. "Get that evidence to someone who can act on it. Make their crimes matter." The chapel door stood ajar when Sarah reached it, ancient hinges groaning as she slipped inside. The interior reeked of mildew and something else, something sweet and rotten that made her gag. Broken pews lay scattered across the floor like bones, and the altar was stained with dark patches that could have been water damage or something far worse. Behind her, gunfire continued in sharp bursts. Marcus's voice shouted something she couldn't make out, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Sarah found the tunnel entrance behind the altar, hidden beneath a stone slab carved with Latin phrases that seemed to writhe in the beam of her phone's flashlight. The narrow passage beyond descended steeply into absolute darkness, water trickling along the walls in thin streams. She was 20 feet into the tunnel when she heard footsteps in the chapel above, multiple sets, moving with military precision. A voice she didn't recognize spoke in clipped tones. "Thermal shows one person in the tunnels. Sir wants her taken alive if possible." The passage branched ahead, splitting into 2 identical corridors that vanished into the earth. Sarah chose the left path instinctively, then immediately second-guessed herself. Every step took her deeper into the Greymoor family's buried history, past alcoves that might once have held wine or weapons or worse things entirely. Her phone's battery indicator showed 15%. In the distance behind her, she could hear voices echoing through the tunnels, accompanied by the sweep of professional-grade flashlights that turned the rough-hewn stone walls into a shifting maze of light and shadow. The tunnel opened suddenly into a wider chamber, and Sarah's light revealed something that made her stop breathing. The walls were lined with alcoves containing dozens of photographs, family portraits spanning generations, each face bearing the distinctive Greymoor features grown increasingly twisted through generations of deliberate inbreeding. But it wasn't the photographs that froze her blood. It was the fresh footprints in the muddy floor and the sound of breathing that wasn't her own. "Hello, Miss Chen," said a voice from the darkness ahead. "Welcome to the family crypt. I'm afraid this is where your story ends." The abandoned Greymoor mansion loomed against the storm-darkened sky as Sarah Chen crept through its rotting corridors, her phone's flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet seemed to echo like gunshots in the cavernous rooms. She'd come here following Marcus Greymoor's final desperate text message, a confession and a location that promised to expose everything. Behind her, Detective Rodriguez moved with practiced silence, his weapon drawn. They'd lost contact with backup 20 minutes ago, their radios crackling with static as they'd entered the valley where the mansion sat like a cancerous growth among the dead trees. "There," Sarah whispered, pointing toward a faint light bleeding from beneath a door at the end of the hallway. As they approached, voices became audible, heated, desperate exchanges that made Sarah's blood run cold. She pressed her ear against the door and heard Senator Catherine Greymoor's voice, sharp with authority despite the tremor of fear beneath it. "He betrayed us, Mother. Marcus has destroyed everything our family built over 5 generations. An older woman's voice, brittle as autumn leaves, responded with venom. "Then we clean up his mess. We've survived worse scandals than some dead reporter's fantasies." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. They were talking about her as if she were already dead. Rodriguez positioned himself on the opposite side of the door, nodding grimly. Sarah gripped the handle, counting silently to 3 before throwing it open. The room beyond was a nightmare tableau illuminated by flickering candles. Ancient portraits of Greymoor ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to watch with malevolent intelligence. In the center stood Senator Greymoor, her perfectly styled hair disheveled, holding a gun pointed at Marcus, who knelt bleeding on the stone floor. Beside her stood the family matriarch, Eleanor Greymoor, 93 years old and radiating a cold malice that seemed to poison the very air. Her gnarled hands clutched a leather-bound ledger, the same one Sarah had glimpsed in the photographs Marcus had sent her. "Drop your weapons!" Rodriguez shouted, his gun trained on the senator. Catherine Greymoor's laugh was hollow, unhinged. "You're too late, detective. The story dies here, tonight, just like Marcus should have years ago when we first discovered his conscience." Sarah stepped forward, her phone recording everything. "It's over, Senator. The whole world knows about the Greymoor bloodline, about the murders, the cover-ups. Marcus already sent me everything." Eleanor's rheumy eyes fixed on Sarah with predatory focus. "You stupid girl. You think this is about money? About politics?" She lifted the ledger with trembling hands. "This family has shaped American history for over a century. Presidents, Supreme Court justices, military leaders, all of them connected to our blood, all of them preserving the natural order." "The natural order of what?" Sarah demanded, though part of her already knew the answer would haunt her forever. "Genetic superiority," Catherine said, her voice taking on the cadence of a true believer. "Pure bloodlines, controlled breeding. We've been cultivating the perfect specimens of human leadership while the masses wallowed in mediocrity." Marcus raised his head, blood streaming from a gash above his eye. "Tell her about the children, Catherine. Tell her what happens to the ones who aren't perfect enough." A chill ran down Sarah's spine as understanding dawned. The missing persons report she'd uncovered, the children from Greymoor-connected families who'd simply vanished. They weren't victims of outside predators, they were victims of their own relatives, culled from the genetic line like defective livestock. "How many?" Sarah whispered, the words scraping her throat raw. Eleanor smiled, a grotesque expression on her ancient face. 47 over the decades, each one a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the bloodline. Rodriguez stepped closer, his weapon steady. "You're all under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." Catherine's gun swiveled toward him. "I don't think so, Detective." The shot rang out deafeningly loud in the confined space, but it wasn't Catherine who fired. Marcus had lunged forward, grabbing an antique letter opener from the floor and driving it into his sister's leg. Her gun discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as she screamed and fell. Eleanor shrieked in rage, clutching the ledger to her chest like a shield. Rodriguez was on Catherine in seconds, kicking away her weapon and securing her hands. Sarah dove for the ledger as Eleanor tried to throw it into the fireplace. The old woman's grip was surprisingly strong, her fingernails raking bloody furrows across Sarah's arms as they struggled. "You'll destroy us all," Eleanor gasped. "The chaos that will follow, you have no idea what you're unleashing." Sarah wrenched the ledger free, just as police sirens wailed in the distance. Marcus slumped against the wall, a sad smile crossing his battered features. "It's finally over," he whispered. But Sarah knew better. The Greymoor conspiracy was just the beginning. As she opened the ledger and saw page after page of names, politicians, judges, business leaders, she realized the true scope of what they'd uncovered. The investigation that had nearly killed her was about to become the story that would reshape American politics forever. The real work was just beginning.